For most of East and Central Europe, during this time period, it's imagined that there's this, during the Cold War, that there's Iron Curtain has descended, and that the East has become this monolithic, dominated region of the Soviet Union, and much of that is myth, a Cold War myth. Uh, the Soviet Union definitely does have an influence in this area. And again, though, it's local leaders are the ones who are pursuing most of these policies, and and there's a command, economy, so it's inefficient, and there is a certain security though in the region because there's high literacy rates, there is free health care, there's full unemployment, and this pacifies the populations really of the area. After what they went through with World War I and World War II, especially that first generation, they see this as a trade-off. So maybe there's not a lot of political freedom, although there wasn't a lot of great political freedom beforehand. So that not much has changed in terms of one autocratic government to another. And so that first population, the one that went through the war especially, they're happy to eat. They're happy to have a house. And so much is kind of overlooked in the early years. The generation that was born later, however, that was born in the 50s and 60s, want something else. They don't remember the war. They were either children or they weren't even born yet. So for them, those who were born later, they're going to be the force in many of these places for greater change. And there's really a two-pronged attack against these communist regimes. There's dissident movements that come from high intellectual writers, and Central Europe is going to be famous for these people like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, and a man named Arpad Gunc in Hungary, who was a playwright and poet and such as well. And there's some of the literature from this time period from Milosz in Poland and such reflect their need for political freedom, for writing and freedom of expression and such. But the general population is just kind of in a wait and see kind of attitude, really. The younger generation is going to start to push the bounds in the 1980s, and it's going to begin in many ways with the environmental movement, especially what happened after Chernobyl. And there's going to be pressures to liberalize, not necessarily in direct attacks against the government. And there's going to be protests, for example, on the Danube over a nuclear facility that was going to be built on the Slovak-Hungarian border. And so you start to see new types of protests, not just this intellectual writer who's kind of movement. In 1977, there was something called Charter 77, where many of the intellectuals had signed basically a manifesto demanding rights and human rights to the region, but not much changed. And no one imagined the 1989 changes and the fall of communism in the area. Truly, there were these undercurrents happening, and strange and different types of protests. But it was like a house of cards that people didn't realize was so weak at the time period. The Solidarity movement began to push the boundaries again in the late 80s. And in 1989, there was a threat that there'd either going to be a military kind of occupation again, that there's going to be martial law, or they were going to try to somehow negotiate with Solidarity. And those negotiations, they didn't want to go through martial law again. The government didn't have the political clout to make it happen again. And so they began negotiations that were called the Round Table Talks in the late winter of 1989, early spring. And the Round Table Talks led to full democracy. And Solidarity was able to run for an election, and they won in June of 1989. This spurred these other local democratic movements throughout Eastern Europe, and we see the fall of happened in Hungary in 1989. By October of that year, they had reformed into a democratic state. Czechoslovakia in November 1989, and in December, the only really bloody version of this happened in Romania, and they overthrew the horrible communist dictator Ceausescu. And then eventually changes are going to happen in Yugoslavia as well, but they're not going to be successful changes. And in the Baltic states, they're going to start to break away in 90, 91, demanding autonomy. Gorbachev is not going to have the political clout to stomp that down, so he's going to allow these breakaway republics to form into new nations again. And they're going to look back to the 1930s as a time period when they were free and independent, and they again reclaim it again in the 89 through 91 era. Yugoslavia became the anomaly. It was a state that was multi-ethnic, that remained peaceful under the communist era, under the strong hand of Marshal Tito, who had led the communist guerrillas during World War II and then became the leader of Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia separated itself from the Soviet Union in terms of politics in the late 40s and became the pariah in many ways of the communist countries, because it refused to bow down to the Soviet Union, although it still remained a communist nation. And what happens in Yugoslavia is that you start to see this rise of nationalism and right-wing nationals. So instead of forming this democratic nation that would champion all the minorities, local populations that had not become a homogeneous state like that happened before in Hungary and Poland and such, World War II had let that happen. But through population transfers, ethnic cleansing and killing and such, in most of Central Europe, homogeneous states had emerged. Poland was 90-some% Polish. Hungary was 90-some% Magyar or Hungarian. Yugoslavia was still Slovene, Croat, Serbian, Albanian, Macedonian, Montenegrin, with various, languages and religious backgrounds. And the Croat, first Slovenia is going to pull itself away, and without much of a fight. Then Croatia tried to do the same thing, and the first Balkan War of that era began, and Croats and Serbs fought for control and dominance of their particular regions, and both of them used ethnic cleansing to try to achieve those goals. That war is going to end in the mid-1990s, and then Serbia is going to try to use genocide against its Muslim populations to make a wholeheartedly Serbian state, Orthodox Serbian state, and the attacks on Bosnia begin in the mid-1990s. And some of the worst cases of genocide that they had not seen in Europe since World War II begin again in this region. It begins in the Croat War, and then it happens in Bosnia, and eventually NATO is going to step in under the leadership of President Clinton and bomb Serbia when they do this to their Kosovo Albanian population in the Kosovo region of Serbia, and it's in the late 1990s. And here we are today in the 21st century, and this area is still under NATO control, and Serbia is trying to regain its position in European politics.